Well, thank you for that very warm welcome. You know, as the cow said to the Maine farmer, thank you for a warm hand on a cold morning. Jackie and I are here today to answer questions at a press conference, and the press corps has chosen one spokesperson, and you are going to hear his questions along with us, and we are going to attempt to be rather candid and also very truthful with you. And so I guess we'll take the first question now. Please listen for it along with us.
Mr. President.
Yes.
Would you tell us all about Marilyn Monroe?
Second question.
President and Mrs. Kennedy, if you had to describe your childhood in 2 words,
yes,
what would they be?
Happy, sad.
Sickly and beat up.
I was born just 3 months before the stock market crash, on July 28, 1929. Although my childhood came during the Depression, it was an extremely happy time for me. My father, John Bouvier, was a well-to-do stockbroker. When the market crashed in 1929, it was my mother's father who assisted my father financially by loaning my parents a substantial amount of money and allowing us to live in a Park Avenue apartment, rent-free, provided my father stopped his womanizing. Jacques Bouvier believed he could have any woman he wanted, and he usually did. But these were wonderful years for me as my mother taught me how to ride and jump horses. I was always in my riding outfit and never felt happier than in the saddle. I also grew extremely fond of my father during these years. Ironically, as most of the nation was coming out of the Depression, my sadness was just beginning. In the summer of 1940, when I was 11 years old, my mother and father divorced. My younger sister Lee and I were caught in the middle of a horrible power struggle, and I became very depressed. Then in 1942, my mother married Hugh Auchincloss. We were again financially secure, having beautiful homes in which to live. But I missed my father deeply.
Well, I was born on May the 29th, 1917, in Brookline, Massachusetts, the second child of what would eventually become a family of 9 children. 6 years after my birth, my father Joseph became a bona fide millionaire, and over the years he would become vastly richer. And as for me, most of my childhood was spent being sick. Scarlet fever, bronchitis, measles, chickenpox, whooping cough, German measles, mumps, diphtheria, allergies, colds, flus, hives, an irritable colon, a weak stomach, asthma, jaundice, appendicitis, tonsillectomy, pneumonia, urethritis, and a bad back. See, actually, the left side of my body was slightly smaller than the right, so I eventually came to wear a small lift in my shoe. And, well, this probably did contribute to all the back problems that I had, and also the rupturing of a spinal disc while playing football at Harvard. Certainly it didn't help. You know, my brothers used to joke that a mosquito took a great risk in biting me. With my blood, it would be the mosquito who'd end up dying. Well, that explains the sickly part of the answer, and now on to beat up. As you can gather from what I just said, I was a pretty scrawny little kid, and therefore I did get beat up quite a lot by my own older brother, Joe. My father instilled in all of us this great spirit of competition, but nowhere was the spirit more manifest than between Joe and myself, and most of the time I was on the receiving end. But I was not afraid to challenge my big brother. I remember one day we had this big bicycle race. Now we each left going in opposite directions around the house. So we came around to the front. We were each racing towards that finish line, and we were directly facing one another, and neither one of us would waver, and so of course we crashed. Well, I ended up getting 28 stitches for my victory, and my brother was totally unhurt.
Mr. President?
Yes, sir.
How did you become a war hero?
It was absolutely involuntary. They sank my boat. Now, to answer that rather serious question in more detail, my father had to pull a lot of strings so that my illnesses and physical problems were overlooked by the Navy, and I was eventually sent to the Pacific, to the Solomon Islands, as captain of a PT boat, PT 109. On August the 2nd, 1943, we were rammed by a Japanese destroyer, and the boat sank. My heroics in saving the life of one of my men and eventually bringing about our rescue made the headlines back home. I was awarded the Navy and a Marine Corps medal, along with a Purple Heart, and a little bout with malaria would also reward me with some recurrent malarial symptoms as well. But there was also a more tragic effect from the PT boat incident. For the first time in my life, I'd finally beaten my older brother Joe at something. I had become the war hero first. Maybe that was the reason why Joe volunteered to fly an extremely dangerous bombing mission on August 12th to try to take out a German V-2 rocket installation. My brother's plane was to be like this flying bomb, but it exploded prematurely, and Joe was killed. It was a horrible loss for our family, but it also would mean a tremendous change in my future. You see, up until then, it was Joe who was going to be the politician in the family, and now that mantle fell to me. So after a brief stint as a newspaper journalist, following my discharge from the Navy, I ran for, and I was elected to Congress in 1946, taking my seat, of course, in 1947. Yes.
Jackie, 1947 was an important year in your life as well, wasn't it?
Yes, golly gee, thank you for asking. That year, a New York Society columnist chose me as Queen Debutante of the Year after my coming out in Newport, Rhode Island. Then it was on to Vassar for me, followed by a year at the Sorbonne in France. While there, I learned to speak French fluently and truly developed my lifelong affection for French art and literature. After all, the Bouviers were of French descent. I finished my college education at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and it was at that time that Jacques and my paths crossed.
Mr. President?
Yes.
How did the romance between you and Jackie begin?
At a dinner party, I leaned across the asparagus and I asked her for a date.
You did not. We did officially meet at a dinner party, given by mutual friends Charlie and Martha Bartlett. Jack called me the next day, but he did not ask me out. So we went our separate ways. I on a tour of Europe with my sister Lee, while Jack began campaigning for his Senate race in Massachusetts. Then he went on a tour of the Far East.
And experienced another brush with death. I had almost died when I was only 2 years old from scarlet fever. And then back in 1947, while on a fact-finding tour of Europe, I fell terribly ill. And in fact, I was given the last rites of the Catholic Church. And it was during this illness that doctors did discover that I had a problem with my adrenal glands. I couldn't fight off infection. But that condition was relieved, first by use of medicine, and eventually by use of the drug cortisone. But in Japan in 1951, my fever rose to 105 degrees. I was delirious and was packed in ice. And my brother Bobby was with me, and he telegrammed Dad that there was little hope for my survival. But survive I did. And you know, while recuperating, Bobby and I spent a lot of time talking about the future. In my brother's mind, there was nothing more important to him than his wife and his children. Children, he told me, gave you hope for the future. Well, I was then 34 years old, and maybe it was time for me to finally just settle down.
Speaking of settling down,
Yes.
it is well known that you had many female friends, so now would you tell us about Marilyn?
When I began the press conference, I stated to you I was going to answer these questions candidly and truthfully, and I guess I must now do so with this rather persistent question. I will tell you all that I know about Maryland. Maryland was one of the original 13 colonies. It's actually bounded by Delaware, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and West Virginia. And that is what I'll tell you about Maryland. Oh, these questions tonight are as tricky as those I would get asked by the reporters back in Washington. And I remember in particular this one female reporter who came into my Senate office one day in 1952.
Senator Kennedy, as the inquiring photographer for the Washington Times-Herald, I want to ask you, what do you think of the Senate pages?
Well, I believe it would be a very good idea if the senators and their pages would change places every now and then. So, Jackie, I read in the New York Times a couple of months ago that you're engaged.
Yes, to stock market broker John Husted. He is the man of my dreams. Well, he was the man of my dreams until May 17th, 1952. John could not make it to an exclusive Washington dance, so at the suggestion of Martha Bartlett, I invited Chuck, and a spark was lit. Weeks later, I slipped my engagement ring off my finger and let it fall in John Husted's pocket. And that's when Jack's and my courtship truly began, and I first came in contact with Jack's family, including his sisters and sisters-in-law, whom I like to call the rah-rah girls.
Well, now, they did not exactly take to Jackie either. When she informed my family that her first name was not Jacqueline, but rather it was Jacqueline, Ethel was overheard to say, and it rhymes with queen. But there was a member of my family who Jackie really did like, my father. And she would say things to him that none of us would ever dare to say. Well, one night, for example, we were all seated around the supper table where we always held our important discussions, and Bobby and my father, they were debating back and forth on how to battle air pollution. Well, Jackie pitched in with,
Call out the Air Force. Have them spray the congested urban areas with Chanel No. 5.
And on another occasion, my father was relating how he gave each of his children $1 million when they turned 21, so they would be financially secure and would not have to depend upon him. Well, she joined that conversation by asking,
Do you know what I would do if you gave me $1 million? I'd ask you for another $1 million. Although I was very different from the other girls in the family, I do believe that Joe might have liked me best. Chuck and I kept our public relationship very low-key, although privately it was quite passionate. And though we were apart often, our dates together were really quite normal. Movies, many of which I paid for because Chuck never carried any money with him. Dinners and games at the homes of friends, and making out in his convertible. Chuck was not the great romantic. He did not write me great love letters, although once I did receive this postcard from Bermuda. Wish you were here, Chuck.
Our wedding took place on September the 12th, 1953, in Newport, Rhode Island. I was 36, and Jackie was only 24 years old.
Some newly married couples find a hard time adjusting to married life.
Yes.
How were your first years?
Well, I think I'm going to let my wife handle that question.
Well, actually, I found out at once that we would be under the public eye, as just 1 month after our wedding, Chuck arranged for us to be on the television program, Person to Person. Well, the main thing really for me was to be what my husband wanted. He would not and could not be married to someone who tried to share the spotlight with him. I'm just an old-fashioned housewife, really. When all runs smoothly, the food is good and the flowers fresh, I have much satisfaction. I like cooking, but I'm not really very good at it, so I took a cooking course. And when our cook had a free night, I was ready to show off for Chuck. But I burned the meal. Smoke filled the kitchen. I pulled the lamb chops from the oven, but the oven door collapsed, and fat and grease spattered all over the floor, along with the chops, which I just picked up and put back on the plates anyway. The chocolate sauce was burning and exploding. What a smell! I could not even get the spoon out of the chocolate. It was like a rock. The coffee had all boiled away. I burned my arm badly. It turned purple and looked horrible. Then Chuck arrived home and saved the day.
I took her out to dinner. Although Jackie did not like politics at all, she really did help me tremendously. It was Jackie who made me a much better public speaker. She began to give me suggestions for ideas to include in those speeches, and she even took a course in American history to learn a bit more about my profession.
I suppose, except for the fact that Jack was away almost every weekend, constantly campaigning, our first year of marriage was pretty normal. But it almost ended after 1 year, and not from marital problems, but because Jack almost died.
By August of 1954, my back was causing me excruciating pain. My weight had fallen to only 140 pounds, and I had to use crutches, which I hated. So I decided I would undergo a surgical operation that would fuse my vertebrae. However, because of the adrenal problem I had, my chances of survival were only given at 50-50. But I would rather be dead than have to spend the rest of my life on those crutches.
Well, as expected, infection did set in. And for the first time in my life, I really and truly prayed. Jack went into a coma. And finally, Cardinal Spellman was called to administer the last rites of the Catholic Church. For 1 month, he hovered between life and death. He underwent a second, more successful back operation in early January, and it was during that recovery that he wrote his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Profiles in Courage.
And by the spring of 1955, I'd returned to the Senate, but there still was the pain. And it was around this time that my physician, Janet Trevell, began to inject Novocaine directly into my back, sometimes several times a day. Plus, I still had to get those cortisone injections, and I had a ton of other pills and remedies to take daily. But Jackie and I bought a new home, Hickory Hill, a place large enough for the family that we were trying desperately to have.
1956 brought about 2 major surprises. I finally became successfully pregnant.
I made a gallant try at the vice presidency at the Democratic Convention that summer. Now, I lost that bid, but the ease with which I got as far as I did convinced me that 4 years later the bigger prize of the presidency would be within reach. And although Jackie was some 8 months pregnant, she was there by my side all throughout that vice presidential ordeal.
So, Jack, can't you stay by my side now?
Jackie, now you know, my friends and I have had this trip to the Mediterranean planned for months now.
But, Jack, I have less than a month to go. And with the miscarriage I had last year, please don't go with them. Stay with me.
I will be home in plenty of time.
But Jack went. Just 1 week later, I was rushed to the hospital, and there I gave birth to a baby girl, whom I called Arabella. Only Bobby Kennedy was by my side, and Arabella was born dead. At first, I blamed myself for Arabella's death. I should have stopped smoking. Maybe I just couldn't have children. I shouldn't have let Jack leave my side. But then I turned my feelings of guilt outward. It was the hectic pace of that convention. It was politics in general. Why wasn't my husband at my side? Severe depression set in. Jack again immersed himself in politics. And I finally left for England to spend time with my sister Lee, and I began to enjoy myself with glamorous hunts and parties. That was when rumors of our marital problems began appearing in print. Time magazine ran an article that Jack and I were getting a divorce. And it also aired the latter rumor that we had reconciled because Joe Kennedy offered me $1 million to stay with Jack. Well, it's true, I did meet with Joe, and we talked. Jack and I got back together, but I made him sell Hickory Hill. Maybe we would never need a large home for a family.
But that thought changed a bit on November the 27th, 1957, when by cesarean section, Jackie gave birth to a little girl, Caroline.
It was the happiest day of my life.
Mr. President?
Yes.
Tell us about the election of 1960.
Well, first, if you don't mind, just let me say a little bit about elections in general and campaigns. You know they're never easy. And if you think you've got name recognition, I'll guarantee you this, you'll never have enough. And I've got a good example of that from 1960. I was campaigning, and I came upon this rather small restaurant, but right above its roof was one of our big campaign billboards, you know. So I went inside to get a chocolate shake. Hello, I'm John Kennedy. The counterman gave me a blank stare. I said, you know, I'm running for president. And he just stared at me again, and then he drawled, President of what?
Remember how I told you that Jack never carried any money with him? Well, his mother, Rose, decided to do an informal poll on her own of taxicab drivers, and she asked this one fellow for whom he was going to vote, and he replied, that young Kennedy fellow. Then the driver noticed the address to where Rose was going, and he asked her if she was by any chance related to John Kennedy. And Rose proudly stated, oh yes, I'm his mother. Am I glad to see you, the cabbie said. Your son owes me $1.65.
Then there was this time in Wisconsin, February the 15th. I met a lady who had 13 children. And I said to my wife, Jackie, why don't you come over here and shake hands with this lady? Maybe some of it will rub off on you.
Oh, I did. And amazingly, almost 9 months to that day, John Jr. was born on November 25th, 1960. But Jack's biggest problem with many voters was his religion. He was Catholic, and there was a fear that he would be under the control of the Pope. Although Harry Truman commented, it's not the Pope I'm afraid of, it's the Pop. But Jack, in his typical style of enjoying a good fight, took the issue head on. He appeared before and spoke to a conference of ministers being held in Houston, Texas.
I believe in America, where the separation of church and state is absolute, where no Catholic prelate should tell the president, should he be Catholic, how to act, and also where no Protestant minister would tell his parishioners for whom to vote, where no religious body seeks to impose its will directly or indirectly upon the populace through the public acts of its officials, and where religious intolerance will one day end. I mean, this is the kind of America I fought for in the South Pacific, and the kind that my brother Joe died for in Europe. If I should lose the election on the real issues, then I'll return to my seat in the Senate, satisfied I tried my best, I was fairly judged. But if this election is determined on the basis that some 40 million Americans just lost their chance of ever being president on the day that they got baptized, then it'll be this whole nation who will be the loser, in the eyes of Catholics and non-Catholics around the world, in the eyes of history, and in the eyes of our own people.
Jack's victory in the Electoral College was 303 to 219, but his popular vote victory was only some 118,000 votes out of over 68 million cast. Some said there was voter fraud. Others claimed that Jack's father had bought the election.
Actually, I've just received a telegram from my generous daddy. Jack, don't buy a single vote more than necessary. I'm not paying for a landslide. No, my father never sent such a telegram. Actually, he purposely stayed out of the public spotlight all throughout the campaign. And of course, I was very happy to have won and to have become the youngest man elected a president. And at least according to one story, even my opponent, Dick Nixon, could find a bit of humor even in defeat. He supposedly told one of my aides after my inauguration and inaugural address how he wished he had said some of the things I said that very day. Well, you know what part, my aide queried. And Dick Nixon replied, oh, the part that started, I do solemnly swear.
Jack's inaugural address was so magnificent.
So let the word go forth, from this time and place, to friend and to foe alike, that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans, born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace, proud of our ancient heritage, and unwilling to witness or permit the slow undoing of those human rights to which this nation has always been committed and to which we are committed today at home and around the world. And let every nation know, whether friend or foe, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty. So, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. Next question.
First Lady, what were your feelings on your new role?
Well, first of all, please do not call me First Lady. That sounds like the name of a saddle horse. Mrs. Kennedy will do just fine. And I'll answer that by telling you what I told our Chief of Protocol. The children come first. I want to do as little as possible in that framework. When I was told there were certain things I had to do as First Lady, I retorted, I don't have to do anything. I did not want to serve on committees, meet with organizations, nor waste my time meeting with dignitaries from every little country around the world. If I were to add political duties to what I did, I would not have had time for the children. And I mean, if you bungle raising your children, I don't think anything else you do in life matters very much. If the American woman wanted an example to follow from the First Lady, well, that would be the example I would set. When I was home for at least an hour after lunch, I reserved time for Caroline and John, and nothing interfered with that.
Mr. President, how did you feel about your wife's opinion of her role?
Well, it's up to each First Lady to do what best fits her temperament and her own personal inclinations. You must remember, they are not public officials. Her first duty is to her husband and her children, and of course, when her husband's the president, that duty is considerably expanded. And I'll tell you something else Jackie just mentioned, how after lunch was always her time with the children. Well, following that, on many days, she could spend another 2 hours or so behind closed doors, undisturbed, and with a man. Her husband. I know there's been a lot said about our relationship. Some people even going as far as to say, oh, they were never truly in love. And I will admit, our marriage had some rocky moments, but we cherished these little afternoons together.
There were no phone calls, and no official business was sent up. This was our time. We listened to records, and again, contrary to many public opinions, we would even discuss political matters between us. Jack valued my insights, and as I had done before, I continued to help him with his speech writing. These were pleasant times for us, but they did not occur as often as we would have liked. For Jack's 1,000 days in office were filled with one crisis after another.
One of my aides counted 16 crises in the first 8 months of the administration, and among those was the infamous Bay of Pigs invasion. On April 17th of 1961, we had only been in office for 3 months. The invasion by the CIA-trained Cuban exiles to try to take their island back from Castro took place and was a stunning defeat. Of their 1,500 troops, 400 were killed, and all of the remainder were captured.
Jack was in tears all day and extremely depressed.
So what went wrong? Well, in the end, I was determined that United States forces would not be used. I specifically asked, would the plan still succeed without our direct military help? Now, the answer the experts gave me was yes. And they were pathetically wrong. Publicly, I stated, there's an old saying, victory has 100 fathers, but defeat is an orphan. I am the responsible officer of this government. But privately, I just kept saying to myself, how could I have been so far off base? All of my life, I've known better than to depend upon the experts. How could I have been so stupid to let them go ahead?
While Jack was handling these presidential situations, I was already plunging myself into the one accomplishment I desired, restoring the White House.
Jackie will probably tell you some big idealistic reason of why she undertook the project, but the fact of the matter is Jackie just liked rearranging our homes.
Jack, it looked like it was furnished by department stores. There was no sense of history about it. There was nothing, predating 1900 even, on display. But I knew that tampering with the mansion had been a controversial topic in the past, and Congress always seemed reluctant to finance such programs. But I had an idea to solve the money problem, an idea that had been in the back of my mind since I was 11 years old. That was when my mother took me on a trip to the White House. There wasn't even a book that you could buy for a souvenir or to tell you its history. So I conceived of the White House Guidebook, a beautiful paperback book with colored pictures to fund the purchases, and it still continues to this day for that purpose. The White House Historical Association was born to oversee the fundraising. I also used my influence to have Congress declare the mansion a museum, at least the public areas. That way a curator could be hired, so hopefully the furnishings would never again fall into a state of disrepair. The culmination of all this work took place on February 14, 1962, when I took the American people on a televised tour of the restored mansion. By the way, won an Emmy Award for the program. Well, with the mansion restored, I brought to it the greatest in the world of culture to entertain, although Jack had no interest in the opera, and oftentimes dozed off during the symphony.
But I did like Chubby Checkers, The Twist. And the old songs my brothers and I used to sing, like A Heart of My Heart, and Won't You Come Home, Bill Billy, Won't You Come Home. I think that had to be one of my favorites.
The only music Jack really appreciates is Hail to the Chief. I pressed my husband hard for creating a cabinet position for the arts, and although this never occurred, the final result was the latter establishment of the National Endowment for the Arts. Along with Mamie Eisenhower, I was named honorary chairperson for the National Cultural Center, which would eventually become known as the Kennedy Center. I also kept a sense of history about Washington, D.C. itself, as I headed up an effort to stop redevelopment of Lafayette Square directly in front of the White House and save many historical buildings. I suppose I was doing more than I ever planned to do, but it was what I wanted to do.
And Jackie became a fashion setter as pillbox hats and bouffant Jackie hairdos began to be worn by the women all over the country. And Jackie got the praise and the publicity, while I got the bills. $20,000 to $40,000 a year. Jackie, you are breaking me with this spending. How in the world can you spend so much money? The president's salary is only $100,000 a year. You're spending 20 to 40% of it on clothes. This has got to stop.
Jack, I have to dress well, so I won't embarrass you. As a public figure, you would be humiliated if I were photographed in some saggy old house dress. Everyone would say your wife is a slob, and they would refuse to vote for you. Maybe if Jack hadn't given away all of his salary to different charities, he wouldn't have minded as much.
Mr. President, I hate to go back to the Bay of Pigs, but do you think it adversely affected your presidency?
Well, I believe it had an effect on my relationship with the Russian Premier, Mr. Khrushchev, yes. My first summit meeting with him was less than 2 months after that event. At the end of the summit, well, I know he thought I was weak because of that Cuban debacle. And it was perhaps this feeling that allowed him to make two rather bold moves, first in '61 and then in '62. It was just 2 months after the summit that the Russians erected a wall in communist East Berlin to try to stop the flow of people who were trying to flee into free West Berlin. And there were many who wanted me to challenge the Russians with war. All wars start from stupidity. Now, God knows I'm not an isolationist, but it seems particularly stupid to risk killing 1 million Americans over some argument about Germany. If I am going to challenge the Russians with what will be nuclear war, It is going to have to be for a much bigger and more important reason than that. The Russians supplied the reason. In October of 1962, U-2 reconnaissance photos showed the presence of missile bases being assembled on the island of Cuba. Now first the Russians simply denied it. Then they said, well, they're just defensive missiles. But further photos showed the definite presence of offensive missiles that could strike the United States and other countries in this Western Hemisphere. A special committee, ex-com, was formed to discuss our answer to the situation, and we knew some answer had to be given if the United States was going to continue to have any standing in this world. But the crisis only got worse. On Saturday, October 20th, I called Jackie, who is at Glenorchy, our rented home in Virginia, to come to Washington and to bring the children. We took a walk in the Rose Garden alone, and I explained the situation. Jackie, we may be on the brink of a nuclear war with the Russians over the situation in Cuba. The different plans have been put forth, but I've decided on a quarantine of the island. But I do want you and the children to go to the underground shelter.
No, Jack, I'm going to stay here. I'm not going to leave you alone in the White House. On October 22nd, 1962, at 7 p.m., Jack addressed the nation.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. We are initiating a naval blockade of Cuba, and any ship found to be carrying offensive weapons or missile firing equipment will be turned back. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in this Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response on the Soviet Union.
At the same time as this public announcement was being made, Mr. Khrushchev and Jack were exchanging private letters in which the Russian premier seemed to be reconciliatory, although publicly Mr. Khrushchev stated that their ships, a fleet of which were rapidly approaching our line of ships, would not honor the blockade.
We had 180 ships in the Caribbean and thousands of troops ready to invade. We had B-52 bombers in the air, and they were loaded with atomic weapons. But the Russian ships kept getting closer to the blockade line. Russian submarines were spotted among them. And then the message came. The Russian ships had stopped. Some even turned around. And that is when Dean Rusk made his famous statement, "We're eyeball to eyeball," and I think the other fella just blinked. The missiles were eventually disassembled and returned to Russia. I gave all members of XCOM a silver calendar of October of 1962 with the 13 days of the crisis slightly raised, and I got one extra, which I gave to my wife.
And maybe one should have been given to our children as well, because Jack's reaction to this provocation might have been different if he had not had children of his own about whom he cared deeply, as he told his close friend, Dave Powers.
If it weren't for the children, it would be easy to press the button. Not just John and Caroline, not just the children here in America, but the children all over the world who are going to have to suffer and die for a decision I have to make.
But Jack, through his own children, came to a better understanding of all children. He loved reading to Buttons, his nickname for Caroline. He especially liked telling her stories that he would make up himself, and he was even able to laugh as she walked into a press conference wearing my size 10 shoes. And with John, well, there was a special relationship. They just loved one another. John could simply roll around on the floor and Jack would laugh and laugh.
And although the public certainly did worship the public Jackie, they never saw a glimpse of her private side. But White House usher, J.B. West, did, and well, this is what he once said. Many times I watched her play with the children, and I felt this is the real Jackie. She was so happy, so like a little girl who had never grown up. Many times when she was performing with such grace and authority, I felt she was just pretending. She really longs for a child's world where she can run and jump and ride horses. In the position of President and First Lady, many times the private person was different from the public persona.
Mr. President, we've talked about 2 crises in your presidency.
Yes, sir.
How about some comments on other non-crisis endeavors?
Well, thank you. There were numerous projects of which I was very proud. The establishment of the Peace Corps, which would send Americans around the world to do good. The start of our space program, which I guess would eventually send Americans out of this world to do good. Our Alliance for Progress, which sent billions of needed dollars down to Latin America. And I was also proud on our initiative towards mental health and also civil rights. Now, this latter did not come easy. As a matter of fact, I had to call forth our federal marshals on several occasions simply to enforce our laws. And on June the 11th of 1963, I addressed the nation. 100 years of delay have passed since President Lincoln freed the slaves. Yet their heirs, their grandsons, are not fully free. They're not freed from the bonds of injustice. They are not freed from social and economic oppression. And this nation, for all its hopes and all its boasts, will not be fully free until all of its citizens are freed.
As Jack was making this speech, I was relaxing in Hyannisport, 6 months pregnant.
June 26th. I stood in Berlin before the largest crowd I had ever seen in my life, nearly 1 million Germans. Freedom has many difficulties. A democracy is not perfect. But we have never yet had to put up a wall to keep our people in. All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in those words. Ich bin ein Berliner.
I was still resting Hyannisport a few more weeks along in my pregnancy.
On August the 5th, the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was officially signed by the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. This was a very happy day in my presidency.
I was still resting Hyannisport, 8 months pregnant. 2 days later, I took Caroline and John horseback riding. I went into labor and had to be rushed to Otis Air Force Base Hospital. All the way there, I kept pleading, please, hurry. I do not want this baby born dead. We finally arrived, and by cesarean birth, Patrick Bouvier Kennedy was born.
The moment I heard of Jackie being taken to the hospital, I left the White House.
Patrick was so sick. He weighed only 4 pounds 1 ounce. The Catholic chaplain was asked to come and baptize him at once.
We immediately moved Patrick to Children's Hospital in Boston. And I was there, holding his little hand, when at 5 a.m. on August the 9th, my son died. You put up a good fight, Jackie. Oh, he was a beautiful baby.
There's one thing I couldn't bear now. If ever I lost you.
Days later, Patrick was buried. I placed in his coffin my St. Christopher's medal, which Jackie had given to me on our wedding day. And as they lowered that little coffin, I said, goodbye. It's awfully lonely down there.
I was too weak to even attend the funeral. On September 12th, we celebrated our 10th wedding anniversary with Tony and Ben Bradley and other family members. And I gave Jack a new St. Christopher's medal.
And I gave Jackie a gold ring with emerald chips in honor of Patrick.
Then my sister invited me to spend some time with her and an acquaintance of hers, Aristotle Onassis, on his yacht. I cruised on the Christina with Ari, my sister, and other couples. Ari was a truly fascinating man, and I returned home rejuvenated and ready to help my husband.
Now maybe you'll come with us down to Texas next month.
Sure I will, Jack. I'll campaign with you wherever you want. On November 10th, we spent the weekend at the newly finished home of our own, Wexford in Virginia. This was to be our home away from the White House for the rest of this term and for the next 4 years. Then on November 13th, Jack, Caroline, John, and I spent a relaxing afternoon watching kilted bagpipers perform on the White House lawn. The next night, Adlai Stevenson, our UN representative, came for dinner. He had been spat upon and threatened by a mob in Dallas just weeks ago because of certain stances of his in the UN, and he begged us not to go to Dallas. Well, that weekend I spent horseback riding in Virginia, while Jack went with friends to Palm Beach in Florida.
We watched the firing of a Polaris missile, and then some football. And then after dinner, we sat around and we started singing my favorite songs. In fact, that night, I even got up and I did a solo of a rather popular Broadway tune from the late 1930s, the September Song. Oh, it's a long, long way from May to December, and the days grow short when you reach September, and the days dwindle down to a precious few. September, November.
November 21st, Houston, Texas.
When we arrived, I asked one of my aides how the crowd looked, and he told me, well, Mr. President, your crowd this year is only just about the same as last year. But 100,000 more people have come out to cheer for Jackie. I needed Texas in 1964, and the party there was being split by a little feud between Senator Yarborough and Governor Conley, and one of the purposes of this trip was just to see if we couldn't mend a few fences. So from Houston, it was on to Fort Worth, and then into Dallas, where Adelaide had his problems. The Dallas Morning News ran a 4-page ad denouncing the nuclear test ban treaty. And I said to Jackie, we're heading into nut country today. You know, somebody wanted to shoot me from a window with a rifle. Nobody could stop him, so why worry about it? But when we did arrive in Dallas on November 22nd, the crowd that greeted us there was huge and happy. Well, Jackie, this trip is turning out fine. I mean, here we are in Dallas, and I think everything in Texas is going to be fine for us.
We were riding in a convertible. It was hot. I saw this tunnel ahead, and I thought, oh, it'll be cool in the tunnel. Jack raised his hand to wave to a little boy. Then the gunshots. His last expression was so neat. You know, that wonderful expression he would get when asked a question about one of the 10 million pieces of the workings of a rocket. You know, just before he answered, he looked puzzled, and then another shot. I've got his brains in my hands. Oh my God, what are they doing? Oh my God, they've killed Chuck. Chuck, can you hear me? I love you, Chuck. We rushed to the hospital. They wanted to keep me out of the operating room. No, I want to be there when he dies. There was a sheet over Jack. His foot was sticking out of the sheet. I took his foot and I kissed it. Then they pulled back the sheet. His mouth was so beautiful. His eyes were open. They found his hand under the sheet, and I held it the whole time the priest was saying extreme unction. My husband was dead. Lyndon Johnson was sworn in as president, and we returned to Washington, I still wearing the pink bloodstained suit. I wanted everyone to witness what had been done to my husband. I would orchestrate the entire funeral proceedings and immediately had friends begin to research Abraham Lincoln's funeral. I wanted Jacques to mirror his. I also insisted that Jacques be buried at Arlington National Cemetery, and against the wishes of some, devised the idea for the eternal flame to burn at his gravesite. I had Caroline write a letter to her father. John scribbled his name, and I wrote a letter as well. I placed these, a pair of gold cufflinks that I had given Jacques, Bobby's PT-109 pin, and a silver rosary in Jacques' coffin. The funeral was conducted with great solemnity, and following it, dignitaries came to the White House to pay their respects. But I had something more important to do. As soon as that funeral was over, Caroline, the family, and I gathered upstairs in our private rooms for another ceremony. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear John. Happy birthday to you. My son was 3 years old that day. A little child's birthday is very important to them. It could not be lost. I am a living wound. My life is over. I'm dried up. I have nothing more to give. Some days I can't even get out of bed. I cry all day and all night until I'm so exhausted I can't function. And then I drink. I spent a weekend with our friends, the Bradleys, and when it was over, I had to write them a letter. I said, I consider that my life is over, and I will spend the rest of it waiting for it really to be over. Of course, my life wasn't over. I left the country after Bobby Kennedy's assassination, and eventually I did marry Aristotle Onassis. Upon his death in 1975, I stated, Aristotle Onassis rescued me at a moment when my life was engulfed with shadows. He meant a lot to me. He brought me into a world where one could find both happiness and love. We lived through many beautiful experiences together which cannot be forgotten, and for which I will be eternally grateful. I went on to a career in book publishing, had other close male friendships, but most important to me, I raised Caroline and John. Then in 1994, at the age of 64, I joined Jack in the hereafter. Ted Kennedy eulogized me with these words.
She was a blessing to us in the nation, and a lesson to the world how to do things right, how to be a mother, how to appreciate history, how to be courageous. No one gave more meaning to the title of First Lady. The nation's capital city looks as it does because of her. In a large part because of her inspiration and vision, the arts are an abiding part of national policy. During those 4 days in November of 1963, she held us together as a family and a country. Afterward, she went to do what she most wanted, to raise Caroline and John. Her love for Caroline and John was deep and unqualified. She reveled in their accomplishments, she hurt with their sorrows, and she felt sheer joy and delight in spending time with them. At the mere mention of their names, Jackie's eyes would shine and her smile grow bigger. In 1963, just days after Jack Kennedy's funeral, Jackie called Teddy White, a reporter for Life magazine, to come out to see her. There was something she needed Life magazine to tell the country.
I kept telling Bobby, I've got to talk to someone. I want to say this one thing. It's almost been like an obsession with me. You know, all I keep thinking about is this line from the musical comedy, Camelot. At night, before we go to sleep, we had an old Victrola. Chuck liked to play records. his back hurt, on an old patrol at 10 years old. And the song he liked best came at the end of this record. The Last of Camelot. Sad Camelot. Don't let it be forgot that once there was a spot, one brief, shining moment that was known as Camelot.